Before dawn, while the Taiwan Strait was still dark, a Japanese destroyer moved south into one of the most politically charged waterways on Earth. It did not drift into that passage by accident. It did not edge in, test the mood, and quietly retreat. It entered, kept moving, and stayed there for hours while every Chinese sensor that mattered was watching. Warnings came over the radio. Chinese forces tracked the ship the entire way, and yet the one thing Beijing did not do was the one thing that would have made this a different story. It did not physically stop it. That is the moment that matters, not the press statement after, not the angry condemnation, not the predictable language about provocation and damaged relations. The moment that matters is that a Japanese warship sailed through the Taiwan Strait in full public view under Chinese surveillance, and China watched it pass. That is not a routine navigation story. That is not just another tense day in East Asia. That is a crack in an atmosphere Beijing has spent years trying to build, because the real story is not that one Japanese destroyer crossed one strait. The real story is that Japan has begun to answer China's entire pressure system as a system. That is what makes this so important. If this were only about one transit, it would still be dramatic. A Japanese warship crossing the Taiwan Strait is not a trivial event. It is a live challenge to a space Beijing wants to surround with fear, political ambiguity, and psychological ownership. But if you read it only as one transit, you miss the thing that gives it real weight. This happened after months of escalating pressure. It happened after repeated gray zone operations. It happened after maritime militia tactics, after standoffs around the Senkaku Islands, after rehearsal, like efforts to normalize encirclement logic, after attempts to teach the region that pressure around Taiwan and East China Sea is just the new background music of Asian security. And it happened just 48 hours after Russian warships visited China. That timing is not decoration, it is structure. Tokyo was not simply moving a ship. Tokyo was answering a pattern. To understand why that matters, you have to understand how China has tried to build control in East Asia without openly starting the kind of war that would unify the entire region against it all at once. China's method has not been to conquer everything in one stroke. Its method has been accumulation, one exercise, one airspace restriction, one Coast Guard intrusion, one swarm of fishing vessels that are not really just fishing vessels, one patrol that lingers a little longer than the one before it, one temporary measure that starts to feel less temporary each time it is repeated, each move. Taken alone, can be explained away. Each move can be treated as a manageable irritation. Each move gives nearby capitals a reason to stay calm, issue a statement, and tell themselves that escalation would be worse than adaptation. That is exactly why the method is powerful. China does not need every move to produce immediate surrender. It only needs the region to begin adjusting its behavior little by little until Beijing's preferred reality starts to feel normal before it is ever formally accepted. That is what I mean by a pressure system. Not a single incident, not a single threat, a connected architecture of intimidation designed to change the behavior of everyone who lives around it. Once you see that, this Japanese transit looks very different. Japan was not simply asserting a rite of passage. Japan was rejecting the idea that China gets to decide which actions in nearby waters are normal, which are risky, and which are off limits. Japan was refusing the invisible permission structure Beijing has been trying to construct. That is why one destroyer in one strait suddenly carries so much weight. The Taiwan Strait is not just a waterway, it is a test chamber. It is one of the places where Beijing wants the whole region to internalize a lesson. China does not need to fire the first major shot to make other powers behave more carefully around issues it considers central. It only needs to make the cost of visible defiance feel high enough for years. That atmosphere has worked, maybe not perfectly, maybe not completely, but enough to shape decisions, language, timing, and posture. Enough to make governments ask not only what they are allowed to do under international law, but what Beijing might do if they act too openly. Enough to move policy through anticipation, which is always cheaper than direct force. And now Japan has taken one of the most visible steps imaginable against that atmosphere. That is why Beijing's problem is bigger than the transit itself. A power that wants to dominate a regional environment through cumulative pressure can survive one act of defiance. What it struggles with is the meaning that spreads after the act, because once a country proves to itself and to everybody watching that the line can be crossed and the world does not end, the line begins to look different the next time. That is how psychological orders weaken, not always through one decisive battle, sometimes through a series of public moments when fear stops compounding on one side and starts eroding. Instead, Japan understands that, and Japan's decision did not come out of nowhere. Look south and west from Japan, and the map explains the story. The first island chain is not an abstract phrase from a defense paper. It is the deepest structural problem for Chinese naval expansion in the Western Pacific. The geography running from southern Japan through Okinawa toward Taiwan forms a set of narrow exits and dangerous passages. If China wants to convert raw naval mass into unrestricted access to the broader Pacific, it has to deal with those exits. Japan sits directly on that problem. That is why the waters around the Senkaku Islands matter so much. That is why the Miyako Strait matters so much. That is why gray zone harassment around Japanese administered areas has never been just about sovereignty theater. It is about wearing down one of the states whose geography helps confine Chinese power before it reaches the open ocean. For Beijing, the logic is simple. If you cannot remove geography, you pressure the state that sits on geography, you stretch its nerves, you test its responses, you push civilian-looking platforms into sensitive areas. You make Coast Guard and maritime militia operations do political work that warships would do too aggressively. You surround the target with a sense of permanent friction. You make every day costly enough that the target starts negotiating with itself before it negotiates with you. That is the long game. And Japan has been living inside that game for years. Around the Senkaku Islands, Chinese vessels have not merely shown up, they have patrolled, lingered, returned, and attempted to normalize repetition itself. Repetition is strategic. If something happens once, it is an event. If it happens constantly, it becomes an environment. China understands that very well. So the pressure system kept widening. Maritime militia tactics blurred the line between civilian presence and strategic intent. What looked like fishing pressure was often really sovereignty pressure in work clothes. What looked like routine activity was often a rehearsal in ambiguity. This matters because ambiguity is one of Beijing's most useful tools. An overt military clash creates clarity. Clarity can unite coalitions. Clarity can trigger formal commitments. Clarity can narrow options. Ambiguity does the opposite. Ambiguity makes every response harder. If a government responds too weakly, it looks passive. If it responds too strongly, it can be accused of militarizing a civilian incident. Ambiguity drains time, judgment, and political confidence. It is the preferred operating condition of powers that want to change the environment without paying the full cost of changing it openly. Japan has finally decided that answering incident by incident is not enough. That is the deeper meaning of the destroyer transit. Tokyo is no longer treating Chinese pressure as a collection of separate annoyances. It is treating them as parts of one connected campaign. And once you do that, your response changes. You stop asking only how to handle each intrusion. You start asking how to answer the whole architecture that links them together. That is what Japan is beginning to do. This is also why the Russian connection matters 2 days before the transit. Russian warships visited China on paper that can be read as a standard port call. Another signal of partnership, another familiar reminder that Moscow and Beijing can coordinate presence when they want to. But in strategic politics, timing is often the message. Tokyo did not see a harmless coincidence. Tokyo saw the reinforcement of a broader pressure environment. Japan has to think north and south at the same time in the north. There's the unresolved strategic wound of the northern territories and Russia's military position around the Kurils and the Sea of Okhotsk. Russian pressure on Japan is not imaginary, and it does not need to look like a full-scale crisis every day to shape Japanese planning. A state that faces one major pressure axis in the north and another in the southwest learns quickly that simultaneous signaling matters even when formal coordination is impossible to prove. So when a Japanese destroyer entered the Taiwan Strait less than 48 hours after Russian ships visited China, the message extended beyond Beijing. Tokyo was saying that the region's intimidation climate will not be accepted as a shared fact simply because China and Russia want it to feel inevitable. That is a bigger signal than a transit alone. And it tells you something important about where Japan is now psychologically for too long. Outside observers kept describing Japan with a vocabulary that belonged to an earlier era, restrained, cautious, constitutionally boxed in, reluctant to push too far, able to build capability, but fundamentally hesitant to translate it into visible strategic action. That description is aging badly. Japan is not becoming reckless, but it is no longer organized around passivity. It has been quietly, steadily building a posture that can do more than protest. Its helicopter carriers have been transformed into platforms that can support 35B operations, which means Japan's maritime air power is becoming more flexible and more politically meaningful. A moving deck is not just military hardware. It is a statement that operational reach no longer has to remain tied to static land bases alone. Its destroyer fleet is large, modern, and increasingly part of a broader deterrent design rather than a purely defensive image management exercise. Its missile programs matter because range changes political geometry. Once a country can impose cost across greater distance, it is no longer just guarding a shoreline, it is reshaping how an adversary calculates movement. Its submarine force matters because choke points become more dangerous when quiet hunters operate inside them. Its alliance with the United States matters because even when Japan acts with its own intent, everyone in the region knows those actions unfold inside a larger strategic ecosystem. And most of all, its geography matters because hardware layered onto geography is more dangerous than hardware floating free. A missile battery on the right island, a submarine near the right channel, an aircraft-capable deck in the right corridor, a destroyer moving through the right strait at the right time. This is how strategy stops being a paper discussion and becomes an image other governments cannot ignore. That is what happened here. Japan turned a structural argument into a cinematic fact for years. Analysts could talk about first is land, chain pressure, maritime coercion, gray zone operations, and Chinese expansion logic in abstract terms. Then one Japanese destroyer moved through the Taiwan Strait before sunrise, stayed there under surveillance, and emerged on the other side while Beijing denounced the act but did not stop it. One ship, one transit, one image. And inside that image, a larger sentence. Japan is no longer willing to live quietly inside China as pressure architecture. That sentence will travel far beyond this one episode because the real audience was never just China. The audience was every capital in Asia that has spent years adjusting itself to Chinese pressure one notch at a time. The audience was every government that has wondered whether visible resistance still carries too much cost. The audience was every military planner, foreign ministry, energy trader, and alliance manager trying to judge whether Beijing's atmosphere of inevitability is still thickening or finally beginning to fray. This is why the next stage matters even more than the transit itself. What does China do now? Its options are not as comfortable as they look. If Beijing responds too softly to future acts of defiance, then more regional actors may conclude that its pressure system has limits they can test in public. If it responds too harshly, it risks accelerating the very balancing coalition. It most fears a coalition held together not by American speeches alone, but by the behavior of states like Japan deciding that adaptation has become more dangerous than resistance. That is the trap inside cumulative coercion. Pressure works until somebody answers it cleanly enough to expose that pressure is not the same thing as control. China still has enormous power. It still has naval mass, industrial scale, Coast Guard reach, maritime militia depth, and the ability to generate fear through repetition. None of that disappears because one Japanese destroyer sailed through the Taiwan Strait, but something else is now true at the same time. A state that has spent years trying to define the environment around Taiwan in the East China Sea through relentless presence just had to watch a major neighboring power enter one of its most sensitive spaces, endure the warnings, and continue south. That matters. Because presence is not sovereignty, surveillance is not interdiction, a warning is not a stop, and a watch transit is still a completed transit. Those distinctions sound technical until the day they become visible, then they become political facts. That is what this episode produced, and that is why it will matter longer than the next news cycle. The Pacific is entering a more dangerous phase, not because war is guaranteed tomorrow, but because the old emotional assumptions are changing. The side that was supposed to keep adjusting is beginning to stop adjusting. The side that was supposed to absorb pressure quietly is beginning to answer pressure in steel, motion, and timing. That changes the rhythm of the region. Now, every future Chinese exercise, every new maritime militia push, every Coast Guard intrusion, every attempt to make strangulation logic feel normal will be judged against this memory. Japan crossed the line Beijing wanted surrounded with fear, and Beijing watched it happen. That memory is strategically expensive. It forces China to work harder to maintain the same psychological effect. It forces everyone else to reconsider what is possible. And it tells you that the real contest in East Asia is not just over islands, routes, or headlines. It is over who gets to define the atmosphere in which every future decision is made. For years, Beijing has been trying to define that atmosphere. Now, Japan has started to contest it. That is the deeper meaning of the destroyer in the strait. Not one ship, not one day. A regional power deciding that China's pressure system will no longer be treated as the weather. It will be treated as something that can be answered. And once that answer has been given in full public view, the Western Pacific does not return to the old psychological order. The old Japan that absorbed pressure, issued concern, and hoped the tide would move elsewhere is fading. The Japan emerging now looks much harder. It is not waiting for the map to be rewritten around it. It has stepped into the water to contest the rewrite itself, and that is why Beijing, as real problem, is not the destroyer that already passed. It is the region that just watched it pass and learned from it.